Welcome to this online lesson asking the question, how healthy were industrialised towns and cities? It's no doubt that the Industrial Revolution brought a lot of changes to the way that people lived. For example, before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the countryside working on farms. But by the end of the Industrial Revolution, the towns and cities had grown enormously. And often, the physical size of these places had not kept pace with the size of the population that they had to accommodate. Therefore, living conditions and disease thrived within many of these industrialised towns. But they did try and do something about it. In this lesson, we're going to have a look at what the problems were and what they did to try and fix them. So the aims will be to examine sources about Victorian living conditions, to explain what living conditions were like, and to assess what needed to be done to improve the health in cities. Let's start by having a look at this famous source. It's called the Silent Highwayman. The Silent Highwayman was a cartoon published in the Punch magazine in 1858. This magazine was incredibly unpopular with people at the time, providing some very cleverly drawn pictures which would go alongside current events and news of the time. Note the caption at the bottom. The Silent Highwayman, your money or your life. A highwayman was a thief in these times, typically someone who would stop people on the road with a gun and say, your money or your life. Well, let's see what the meaning is behind this picture. Your tasks. Firstly, describe what you can see in detail. Secondly, why might this source be useful for someone studying the health in towns? And thirdly, as a challenge, what might be meant by the caption, your money or your life, within this source? Pause the video while you make your notes and write some full sentence answers based upon those questions. Pause the video now. Well, what can we see in the picture? Well, you can see a skeleton rowing a boat through a river. Doesn't look very nice though, does it? This skeleton is supposed to represent death. If you think about it, you can't actually draw a picture of death as a concept, so instead it's often represented with a sort of skeletal figure, often dressed in a black robe. We might be able to infer that the river is the River Thames, which flow through London, and we can see a picture of the city, and we can see a picture of the bridges behind. Within the river we can see all sorts of disgusting things floating around, dead fish and dead animals bloated and putrefying on the surface. Not a very healthy sight at all. Note too that it looks very miserable, but also that the air looks incredibly polluted. This might give us an indication of how it might have smelt or how polluted the city was. So how might this source be useful? Well, it's useful because it gives us some indication of the fact that there were problems with pollution within the towns and cities. But consider this. The very fact that Punch magazine decided to create this source and to publish it shows that there was a public awareness that there was an issue with pollution and living conditions within towns, and that this was leading people to die. But what is meant by this phrase, your money or your life? Well, that's something that we'll come back to, though you may well have already come up with one of your own answers. We're now going to have a look at this source. It's an early photograph, so the quality is not particularly good, but it is a real photograph of a real place. Unhelpfully, I can't tell you precisely where, because this wasn't recorded with the photograph. Source A is an early photograph of a Victorian tenement building. Tenements were sort of the 18th and 19th century equivalent of today's modern flats. They didn't go up quite so high, but you'd have multiple families living within one particular tenement block. Each tenement itself would be a flat of, say, 2 to 3 rooms at most. So, your tasks. List 4 reasons why this would be an unpleasant or unhealthy place to live. Secondly, what might make a photograph a trustworthy source, in other words, one that you can believe? And thirdly, are there any limitations to using photographs for information? Pause the video while you complete those tasks. Well, let's have a look at some examples. There are lots that we could choose from, but here's some typical ones. Notice this in the middle. That is an open sewer. Yes, most of the toilet waste and much of the kitchen waste too would be washed down that ditch through the middle of the street. It wouldn't be covered, it would have stunk to high heaven, and it would have attracted vermin, rats and flies. We've also got how cramped and how poorly built the buildings are. This circled area here would probably accommodate 3 families, one on the ground floor, and the next floor up, and the floor above that, and then possibly another family or possibly 2 families above that. These buildings were incredibly cramped and overcrowded. They were poorly built too. That's one of the reasons why there are very few tenement buildings left now, because most of them were knocked down as dangerous. Notice too that everything is heated by chimneys and by coal smoke. This would have polluted the air and made it very unpleasant and unhealthy to breathe. Notice how small and how dark the windows are as well. The interior of these homes would have been very dark, but also very damp, with few ways of keeping them both warm and dry. However, when it comes to the reliability of photographs, consider this. There is nobody in this photograph. There's possibly one woman sitting on a doorway further down, but it's so unclear we can't really tell. Notice that this particular bit of laundry is very blurred. It would have been fluttering in the wind, and early photographs could not record any pictures which contained movement. Because you needed to leave the camera open or exposed for so long, it would only record things that were absolutely motionless. One of the reasons why people didn't tend to smile in old photographs was the smiles would kind of flicker and they would come out quite blurred. So early photographs can be quite limited in how trustworthy they are, because they can only take photographs of certain things. Nevertheless, they are quite trustworthy in other ways. This is a photograph and it is not an artist's opinion or interpretation of what this really looked like. But the limitations are that you cannot get a picture of any movement within there, and perhaps it is also limited by the fact that it doesn't tell us where it is and when precisely this was taken. We're now going to extend our analysis of this source. You'll need to create a table like this one. There are 3 columns. You can record the source, what the source tells you, and I've included a writing frame to help you if you need that. And then lastly, a question that you could ask to find out more. You do not need to know the answer to this question, but it might be helpful if you could think of a way of finding out the answer to that question. In other words, if there is a piece of information about this source that you simply do not understand, or that you would like to know more about, or perhaps it's something that the source doesn't tell you, this is an opportunity to record that question. This is a useful skill because it allows you to extend your learning by thinking about what else you might be able to find out about the source and better consider its limitations. Pause the video and complete a table of this like your own now. You will need space for 4 sources in total. Pause the video now. Okay, let's consider what you wrote. Here's a basic example. Source A, tenement photo. This source tells me that tenements were filthy, cramped and dark. I think this is useful because it shows how the poor lived in towns and how unhealthy conditions were. However, it may not be reliable because we do not know when and where and why the photo was taken. So a question I'd like to ask to learn more is, how common was housing like this, and did it cause disease? The next source we're going to have a look at is taken from a modern school history textbook. Source B. Gradually, improvements for the poor were made. In 1848, Parliament passed laws that allowed city councils to clean up the streets. One of the first cities to become a healthier place was Birmingham. Proper sewers and drains were built. Landowners had to build houses to a set standard. Streets were paved and lighting was put up. Over time, slums were knocked down and new houses built. However, these changes did not take place overnight. When slums were knocked down in 1875, the poor people had little choice but to move into another slum, making that one worse. Few could afford new housing. Okay, pause the video here and complete the next section of your table. Remember, with the questions, it's something else that you want to find out that the source does not on its own tell you. So you might have come up with something like this. This source tells me that the government eventually passed laws to make towns healthier. I think this is useful because it tells us what improvements were made and when they were made. However, it may not be reliable because we do not know how widely these laws were applied or if they worked. Question I would ask to find out more is this: what punishments were there for people who broke the rules and didn't make these improvements? Now source C. A picture of Manchester drawn in the 1850s. Again, complete the table. Pause the video while you do this. There's a lot going on in this picture and plenty that you could draw upon. In particular, look at the air pollution. You might also be able to see people cramped in the houses down below. It gives us an idea of just how tightly packed the small houses were at this time. Consider what you've put in the table, and then we're going to have a look at the last source. Source D is also from a school history textbook. Most of the new towns were dirty and unhealthy. The household rubbish was thrown out into the streets. Housing conditions like these were perfect breeding grounds for diseases. More than 31,000 people died during an outbreak of cholera in 1832, and lots more were also killed by typhus, smallpox and dysentery. Chimneys, bridges and factory smoke blocked out most of the light in the towns. A layer of dirty smoke often covered the streets like a blanket. This came from the factories that used steam to power their machines. The steam was made by burning coal to heat water. Burning coal produces a lot of dirty black smoke. Again, complete the table for this final source. Press pause now. Well, here are some of the details that you might have picked up upon. Rubbish being thrown out into the streets. This is a time before proper sewage removal and indeed rubbish collection, and so you can imagine how this would attract rats and other undesirable things. It would also cause a huge stink, which at the time was believed to cause disease in and of itself. We now know that that stink is caused by the bacteria, and it's all the germs and bacteria that cause the disease, but they didn't know that at the time. 31,000 people died during an outbreak of cholera. At the time that I record this, the world is going through a global pandemic. And the statistics from this are very grim reading indeed in terms of the number of people who have died. However, this is just one of several diseases that struck people in Britain at this time and indeed around the world. And so mass mortality from disease was a much more real and realistic prospect even then than it is today. Cholera is a particularly unpleasant way to go as well. It's a disease that causes uncontrollable diarrhea, dehydration and painful death. But it's not the only disease in the population. Typhus, which is another nasty infection that can cause a fatal fever. Smallpox, which can be disfiguring, that's even if it doesn't kill you. And dysentery, which again is a form of very serious diarrhea, which can cause dehydration and death. It also tells us something about the air pollution of the time. Smoking chimneys caused a huge amount of air pollution, which could be very dangerous indeed. We're now going to consider exactly how you might answer some of those questions that you wrote down about the sources. This diagram here represents all the surviving evidence that historians draw upon to learn about the past. This is divided between written sources, oral or spoken sources, and non-written sources. There are others that might be up here, but I've simplified it just a little bit. Written sources could be private, for example a diary. They could be official, this is something that's published by the government very officially. Or they could be unofficial, like a newspaper. This might not be sanctioned by the government, but is still written down and written in a quite formal way. Oral or spoken sources do not necessarily have to be recorded live. After all, spoken sources might be recorded digitally or on some other form of media to be played back later. This is how we can hear actually some oral or spoken sources from well after the people who gave those interviews have died. There are also non-written sources. These might be archaeology, what you can find in the ground to give you clues as to what used to be there. The landscape itself, for example like a city, or maybe even a map of one. The buildings that survived from the period, and the artefacts and objects that people used every day. Here is your main task based upon this. I want you to go back to the table that you created on the sources and the questions that you asked. For any questions that you recorded, I'd like you to choose one of these sources, or indeed one that you can think of yourself, which might provide you with the information that you need. Now remember, this is not going to answer the question without you going away and then looking up one of these things. It's more an exercise in recognising how you might go about trying to find the answers to questions that you don't know the answer to already. So to consider the questions you asked about the sources. For each, suggest a source that might answer that question. People's diaries from the time. Remember that diaries are private and people would have described often honestly how it was to live at that time. A school textbook on the subject? The diary of a government minister who perhaps might be passing new laws. A photograph of town living conditions like the ones that we've seen already. Newspaper reports describing the crisis or maybe describing conditions. A preserved old building, possibly one that's been turned into a museum. Such living history museums are quite popular. Government laws. What do these specify and what does that tell us about the conditions? Interviews with eyewitnesses. Okay, virtually everybody who would have experienced these conditions is now long dead, I'm afraid to say. However, lots of interviews were given when they were later in their lives and these can still be accessed. Artefacts such as medicine bottles and cleaning equipment that people might have used to try and treat disease or to try and prevent infection. Information posters and adverts. Maps of slum housing. And a TV or online documentary on the subject. Pause the video now while you identify the best sources possible to answer those questions, and if possible, explain why those sources would be so suitable. Pause the video now. Okay, let's move on to what was actually done to improve matters. First of all, we'll consider some of the key words behind this. Reform. Reform means a change to how things are done, often small and gradual rather than big changes. An example would be the 1848 Public Health Act. This was mentioned in one of our earlier sources, which specified that the local governments were recommended to clear up streets, install lighting and clear slum housing, for example. Philanthropist. This is a wealthy person who believes in helping others with their own wealth. For example, Seabohm Rowntree, who owned the Rowntree's confectionery company, was a philanthropist. He used his money to help the poor. Quaker. A Quaker is a person who follows a particular denomination of Christianity. Many philanthropists actually were Quakers. Part of their religious teachings were that if you had become wealthy, you should use this to help the less fortunate. An example of this would be another chocolate manufacturer, George Cadbury. And model towns and garden cities. These are not miniature towns, these are in fact ones that are designed to be a model of what a town should be like. New towns plan to be pleasant, healthy and moral. In other words, that people were supposed to behave themselves there. Record these key terms if you're unfamiliar with them, and then we're going to move on to a research task. Here's an example of a model town. Okay, not that sort of model town. This sort of model town. That building, believe it or not, is a factory. A textile factory producing lots of cloth. But it looks lovely, doesn't it? Look at all the landscape gardens. Look how clean and airy it looks. This is the factory at a place called Saltaire. It was developed by a man called Titus Salt, who was determined that his workers should live in reasonable comfort. He paid them fairly. He gave them pleasant gardens and parks to rest and unwind in. He ensured that their housing was of good quality. But he was worried about the evil of drink and alcohol, so there were no pubs in Saltaire, the town that bears his name. But that's an example of a model town. Compare that to this. This is one of Booth's poverty maps. This is a colour-coded map of the East End of London, or at least one part of it, that shows different areas and their varying degrees of poverty. Notice that there's a detailed key at the bottom. Along Aldgate High and Whitechapel High Streets, you can see lots of red housing. This means middle class and well-to-do people. There's no yellow on this map showing the upper and upper middle classes. You can see pink areas. These are just off of the main streets. Fairly comfortable, good ordinary earnings. You might say comfortably off ordinary working people. Then you've got a kind of lighter pink, which is mixed. Some comfortable, others poor. Then you've got a light blue, which shows the poor. And this is how it judges it. They earn between 18 shillings and 21 shillings a week for a moderate family. Very poor in dark blue. And then in black, what Booth considered the semi-criminal. Charles Booth wasn't trying to be particularly critical there. He was more saying that these people were having to turn to crime in order to support themselves at all. When you do your research, you'll find out more about Booth's poverty maps and how they highlighted that actually poverty was caused by low wages, rather than necessarily people being bad. You're going to do a research task in which you will produce a mind map. And yes, there is a reason why I've got a bar of chocolate on the screen, which will become clear. You will include sections on all of the following: Edwin Chadwick, Government Reports and Laws, his work on the Public Health Acts, and his report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population. Charles Booth and Seaborne Rowntree, Booth's poverty maps, an example of which we've just seen, and Rowntree's York study and its findings. This was where Rowntree decided to survey the living conditions of his and other workers in York to see why they had such poor living conditions compared to many. Model towns and garden cities, including Saltaire, which we've seen a picture of already, Bourneville, which is why I got the chocolate up there, Letchworth Garden City and Welland Garden City. You will need to include real details and explain how they helped and illustrate your mind map with appropriate pictures. You could do this research online yourself. However, if I've set this lesson directly to you, I've included a fact file that will give you all the information that you need. However, if you want to get good illustrations or extra detail, you could always have a look at doing some further research as well. If you want to, you can pause the video here and use this as your instructions, or simply skip back to this part of the video to review them. But now I'm going to move on to show you how your mind map might be laid out. It might look something like this. Note that there is a different colour for each section. So I've used blue for Government Reports and Laws, green for Model Towns and Garden Cities, and red for Charles Booth and Seaborne Rowntree. You could use any colours that you like, but try and be consistent throughout them. You could also draw links between things that are related. Here's some extension tasks if you find that a bit easy as well. Use information from the fact file that I sent through, if indeed you did get sent it, or your own research that doesn't fit these headings, and create your own new heading of your own. Is there an extra category that I've missed out here? Secondly, who or what did most to improve living conditions in towns? Explain your choice. Right, that should take you a little while, so you can pause the video here, create your mind maps, and then we'll come on to some final summary questions. Pause the video now. Finally then, let's summarise. Give 3 diseases that people in town suffered from. Explain 2 things about living conditions that caused disease or made health worse. Thirdly, explain 1 thing that was done to improve the health of people in towns. And then lastly, what do you now think is meant by the message in this source, your money or your life? Pause the video while you complete these tasks. Well, for questions 1 to 3, there are plenty of examples that you could choose from, but I'm going to concentrate on question 4, your money or your life. Well, this is a bit of a play on words because that's supposedly what a thief or highwayman would say to you if he wanted to rob you. But in this sense, there is a double meaning. The people of cities like London in the Victorian era had quite a simple choice, your money or your life. In other words, spend money on fixing the problem, or the problems might end up taking your life. And these are decisions that governments need to make to this very day. How much money, and it's often raised by taxes, remember, do they want to raise and spend on keeping people healthy? Because if they get it wrong, the result could be mass death. If they get it right, it could mean that many people have their lives saved. Your money or your life. And that's the end of the lesson. Thanks very much for watching. I hope that's been useful and interesting to you. If it has, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much, and goodbye.